thank you very much for getting together here. We're by the River Deben in Woodbridge.
I know, what a beautiful setting.
Lovely
for
spot.
A weekday morning, yeah?
Yes. So you look after the service, Wednesday's Child?
That's right, yeah. So I founded Wednesday's Child about a year ago now, to try and bridge a gap, I suppose, in what I felt was the kind of current service offering around eating disorder support in the region. And people talk a lot now about lived experience and how important that is or is not to the creation of voluntary sector organisations. And I think you can have as many qualifications as you like and as many letters after your name as possible, but you can't beat lived experience for developing a service that helps people that are struggling in some way. And my experience of an eating disorder went on for 20 years, and it was a 20-year battle to try and navigate my way through the devastating illness that is anorexia nervosa.
Yes. And when we talk about eating disorders, obviously your personal experiences of anorexia, and then there's various different types, aren't there?
Absolutely, there's a sort of broad spectrum, and even if you weren't to give something a specific label, a name of a specific eating disorder, you could also say that I very much believe there's a lot of people in general society who probably have disordered eating, so disordered but without particular label to it. But the main ones people will know will be anorexia nervosa, which is a restrictive eating disorder, and bulimia, which tends to include vomiting, a degree of binging and purging. Increasingly people talk also about something called ARFID, which is an avoidant restrictive food disorder, which we're seeing more and more with young people now, where they eat very specific types of food. So doctors and healthcare practitioners are a bit more aware of that one as well, but certainly anorexia and bulimia tend to be the ones that people may have heard of more frequently.
So this is all about the relationship we all have with the food we eat and with ourselves, and how the
relationship with our food, our body, our self-awareness and exercise. For a lot of people it's about exercise and what I'd call lower body movement as well. There tends to be a level of trade-off between food in, exercise and kind of energy output.
Yes, of course, yes.
And it's different people struggle in different ways. For some people it will be purely restrictive, that they'll try and eat as little as possible.
Sure.
Others, and this is something I funnily enough, just last night I was doing an online session for some GPs, and they wanted to have a bit more understanding about eating disorders, and my main point to them was, actually you've got to be really careful when somebody comes through your door and in a surgery, not to say, well, this person obviously has an eating disorder because I can see she's skeletal, and when I weigh her BMI is incredibly low. Actually, none of us know when we look at somebody whether they do have an eating disorder or not, or whether they have disordered eating and a terrible mental health illness. And that's the bit we have to remember, that although there are physical attributes to an eating disorder, more than anything it's an illness of the mind, not of the body.
Sure.
So often somebody could be in a very normal looking body, but still could be binging and purging several times a day and living in that absolute distress, every single moment of every day. Or we might see people very overweight, but equally having a very disordered relationship with their body, their approach to food and exercise. And you can't judge that just by looking at somebody's sort of outer frame.
I should think for a lot of people, they use food as a coping mechanism if they're under stress. And as you say, whilst many people may think an eating disorder and their mind maybe goes to anorexia, and the person who's got a very, would have a very low BMI, actually there must be perhaps a lot more people still whose eating disorder is that they find they're using food to cope.
Absolutely.
And at the moment, COVID-19, we're in September 2020, so Have you seen in the people you're talking with and supporting and helping that COVID is making a difference, or has that not sort of filtered through yet?
Oh,
to
absolutely.
people?
It filtered through from day one. But it's really interesting in the ways in which it's impacted on people, because it's been a positive for some, believe it or not, and also a negative for others. So the natural assumption that, I'm sure you could kind of understand is that anybody that already had an underlying mental health illness of any sort, COVID presented lots of problems the minute COVID came in. We saw that with those people that we were already helping with eating disorders or who'd never come to us before in a number of ways. Some it was just the fear about having to go food shopping. Food shopping became weird for us all. Well, if you've got an eating disorder, going around the supermarket is a really heightened anxiety thing, and it's why Wednesday's Child, one of the things we do is accompanied food shopping, because it's a really stressful environment. But of course, all of a sudden the government was saying, A, you're going to have to queue up, B, you might not get access to the foods that you particularly are very, you're very kind of rigid about, you must have these foods, but you may not get those. You are probably, you're going to have to go around the supermarket on your own. So if you had previously found it was a bit more comfortable to go around with a family member, you can't do that anymore. So everything was that much more stressful and anxiety provoking. So that made things really difficult. We saw a sort of cessation of services, so some people might have been regularly seeing a therapist or going to their community support eating disorders team or to their GP for regular weigh-ins, and of course all of a sudden they were being told don't come in anymore, we'll be in touch when we can, resources are limited. So then that dropped off, people weren't seeing friends and family quite so much, and also for those that were living at home there was, perhaps if they were on their own, there was an opportunity for people to be even more deceitful, and it's an uncomfortable word, but one of the things that is very sort of relatable to people that go through an eating disorder, it can be a really deceitful illness, and you can live, once you're behind closed doors, all your behaviours can worsen. That binging, that purging, that restricting, excessive exercise, all that can happen, more so when you're in lockdown and nobody's seeing what's happening.
Yes.
You're not going in and out of the office, no one's noticing. You're not going in and out of school, no one's acknowledging. So we saw lots of problems from that respect, and yet at the same time, and I would say, okay, it's in the minority, but I was really heartened that we saw some people say, do you know what, this has been my pivotal moment, this has been the moment that I've said, I don't want my eating disorder. And the more I really unpicked that with some people, it was that real awareness, that stark awareness that here was the whole of society saying, this life is terrible, I'm on lockdown, and I can't do this, and I have to only shop here and I only have to shop there. What people with restrictive eating disorders in particular realised was, oh my God, I live like that all the time. I live isolated. I'm very restricted about what I buy from the supermarket. I have a very sort of minimal number of people I see. People with eating disorders in that isolated, just purgatory world they were living in with their illness had already put themselves into that world even without lockdown. So it almost became, I don't want this anymore. And I say I coin the phrase sort of, you're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And for some people, lockdown and the start of COVID was that. It was that kind of moment of, you know what, we never know what's around the corner. I'm done with this. I'm going to use lockdown to really focus on myself and get well. And thankfully we've been able to support people with that, and it has
and
worked.
You have lots of different kinds of support, I think, don't you? You mentioned assisted shopping and providing one-to-one support.
Yeah.
But and I saw on your website, so wednesdayschchild.co.uk, that you have a booklet available for people that you've co-developed with Seed.
Yeah, so Seed got in touch with us from Hull, and they said, were we doing anything? And I said we'd already produced a number of publications, but they were keen for us to collaborate and do something that would be very specific to COVID. So we did a co-production piece that was just very specific to the pandemic. We've moved that on a stage, and in fact one of the pieces that we're in the middle of working on, and that's just on the Wednesday's Child side, is we're producing some online training now, and so it's online learning, different modules that could be used by the sufferer, and I really don't like that word, but you know, the person that's kind of living with an eating disorder, but also could be accessed by someone who's a parent and struggling to kind of get their head around eating disorders, or it could be for a teacher. Right now, even since the schools have gone back in this last week or so, I've had a handful of schools in Suffolk get in touch and say, we've had children return to us who the pandemic's caused a lot of sort of, like you said, that lack of control, and eating disorders have started to filter through. How can you help? What can we do? Can we have you come in school? Can you help us in some way? And as I mentioned, even healthcare professionals, it's astonishing how little education GPs get in eating disorders. It's really quite minimal. So for them to be able to engage with an organisation that has lived experience, and they can say, what does it feel like for a patient? So during COVID, we've been developing that as online learning so that people will be able to dip in and use those resources for themselves.
So you have that support and education, and I've seen that there's a craft group and yoga, and so please tell us about some of the different ways.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I think, again, going back to the fact that when I was really struggling, the number of options to help you through your eating disorder were very limited. It was either you were so poorly and underweight, or just so desperately ill with your mental health illness that you would be found dead, and you would be in an inpatient unit, and you might stay in there for several months or longer, or you are kind of just, you're existing with your eating disorder. I call it sort of functioning anorexic, and you pop into your GP once a week and get weighed, or the GP may even say, well, your weight's not too bad, we'll keep an eye on you every few months and do a blood test. So in the middle of that, you've got people thinking, I'm not sick enough to be in hospital, but at the same time, I've got a devastating illness here that is, and I'm not sure if you or your viewers would be aware of, but eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness, either through suicide or something like cardiac failure, because obviously the pressure you're putting on your heart. So this isn't a skinny disease. This isn't something that someone just says, I want to look like that catwalk model, and this isn't something that just happens to teenage girls. This is a really serious psychiatric illness that even if we get people's weight up, the bit about the neural rewiring that has to happen to get people's brains back to normality, it takes a long, long time. So what I was really aware of during my journey was there really wasn't much in between all that kind of, visit your doctor or be in hospital. So what I wanted Wednesday's Child to be was to be many things to many people, because an eating disorder isn't unique, and the sufferer or the family who's going through it, we all have different approaches and we come at things in a different way. So the craft group is something we run virtually, and it's based a lot on people that have any mental health illness, I guess. A lot of people lean to crafts as almost a distraction and something that gives them a positive sort of validation of being able to produce something. So our craft groups happen over Zoom on a Sunday afternoon. We do that. We have a parent group that runs online as well. In actual fact, we've had more engagement since the group has happened online than we ever did in person.
Yeah, I can understand.
And I'd be interested to know how many other services have found that, but I wonder whether sometimes when we allow people to be slightly more anonymous, even though most of the time people switch their cameras on and stuff, but you're not walking into a room in the middle of Suffolk. You've not got to bump into that person who's your boss or your best friend or whatever. You can be slightly more removed by being behind a camera.
And I suppose if someone wanted to, they can always switch the camera off and just be a voice, couldn't
they? Do.
Until they felt comfortable.
Absolutely.
They had a look at who else was in the room and thought, okay, I feel happy putting the camera on there.
Yeah, and it's so things like that have happened because of COVID will certainly make me look at our services going forward and say, do we need to think about that? Do we need to make this an option? Because for me, the more people that show up, the better. I talk about this showing up in recovery all the time. But if we say to people, your only option for support is you must come to this event on this day, at this time, park your car in the middle of Ipswich, no, don't bring a carer, whatever, come on your... Actually, that's really frightening. And, even those of us with the best confidence in the world, never had mental health illness. You know what it's like walking into a party where you're not sure if you know anyone.
Absolutely.
It puts you off. So if you're also carrying something that is really private to you, is distressing, well, it's probably going to be the reason you're not going to leave the front door, isn't it?
Sure.
So maybe that we will see some positives out of COVID, that we look at different ways and different ways of providing what people need.
And are you finding that people are seeking you out who are providing that signposting? You've obviously mentioned GPs, but have you had people in new social prescribing roles, in community connectors? Are people kind of going, can we link up with you, and in case we need someone to support somebody who comes to us and is telling their story, and we think actually they could really do some help from Wednesday's Child.
Yeah, definitely. We really have sort of onboarded the community connectors with that ethos, which is great, because one of the first things I started doing with Wednesday's Child was I created these wellbeing boxes, and I felt they would be a good social prescribing method, if you like, where you might see somebody with an eating disorder in a surgery or in a first instance, but actually you know that in a way they're not lower down enough down the spectrum or in high enough severity, perhaps you could call it, that there isn't going to be immediate help in community settings. So what else can you give them? I put together these sort of, if you like, kind of carefully curated wellbeing boxes, which have things like affirmation cards and some sort of treats and warm socks, different things that kind of remind people that actually your wellness matters. And it also had some cards in about Wednesday's Child, other services you can connect with, and the social prescribing teams were very open to that and to being able to use those boxes. So they've been a referral point, but so have other charities. So for example, other charities might see somebody because they go there talking about, I don't know, historic sexual assault or family breakdown or depression or alcoholism, and during the course of that it might come out that the coping mechanism now being used is an eating disorder.
Yes.
So we've seen referral through organisations like that, likewise assisted housing organisations. They've signposted to us a lot, and we're slowly starting to see some activity with employee engagement officers, HR teams, people that have responsibility for managing people in businesses, and understanding
That's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And understanding that the way to keep their employees more productive is to look after their mental health and take care of them.
Yes.
And very recently we've had a contact from a HR director who said, this isn't my employee who's got the eating disorder, but my employee's daughter has got a debilitating eating disorder, has now been put in an inpatient unit, and my employee is having to be mum but also walk into the office and manage her team and is struggling. And I guess eating disorders, because they've got some sort of slight stigma attached, it's more difficult to say, Simon, as my colleague, I wanted to talk to you about my daughter that's got an eating disorder. Whereas perhaps if my daughter had been diagnosed with teenage cancer or something, I'd immediately talk to you about it. I think there's a fear among parents that if they talk about their child with an eating disorder, sometimes there might be a level of judgment. And some parents will say to me, I told my family member or my colleague or my boss, and I got, well, surely you can tell her to eat. There's a
People
sort of,
don't understand.
No.
Unless they've been in that space
Absolutely.
through a friend or family, I think there's just a lack of understanding. And when we talk about support for mums and dads, I think I'm right in saying that your support is for all ages.
Oh, absolutely.
And for men and women, boys and girls equally.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I said to you about eating disorder doesn't have a look. We can't judge someone because we see their size or we see, their age even. And I know in Suffolk I'm helping a number of people who are sort of 65 plus.
Sure.
There's a guy I'm helping at the moment, he's 72. And he lost his wife in recent years, he's retired, and he's got no kind of connection, and started to realise he'd got a full-blown eating disorder. And this wasn't, unfortunately his GP just said, well, your appetite falls away as you get older, but I'm sure that's all it is. And he said, I know the difference between a mental health illness and just having slightly less appetite. I'm distressed, I'm depressed, I have a full-blown eating disorder. And he just needed to come to someone that could give him a level of empathy about that.
And it's, I suppose, a very good thing that he had that insight and able to kind of see that in himself. But I wonder how many people would struggle to do that.
Absolutely.
And then would go, but I've got to cope somehow. If I don't cope in this way, how am I going to cope?
Absolutely.
And so they kind of probably feel just very trapped.
Yeah.
And don't know, there's no door apparently.
Exactly.
So men and women, I think I read online the suggestion that this was some research in America. They reckon it was about 2/3 and 1/3. So of people who might have an eating disorder, it's actually maybe as much as 1/3 that are men in a population.
Yeah, I think more recent statistics we've seen in the UK, it's probably about an 80-20, but it's changing all the time. And I think the younger generation of males that we're seeing come through have become much more body conscious than we ever were. Used to, I don't know, a guy's beauty treatments, it'd be, if it was a moisturising cream, that would be a shock. It would be a hair gel, wouldn't it? Yeah. But now guys are very much aware of how they look, and the sort of almost the focus on better eating, protein consumption, muscle building. Whether some of the kind of social media stuff plays into it, some of our reality television, whether or not that's a factor, I think it may be a contributory thing, but everybody's suffering levels of anxiety in society these days, and it's just about what happens to be that control mechanism for that person, how they cope with what they're dealing with in life. But certainly it's true, we are seeing more guys experiencing eating disorders. Yeah.
And that visibility on social media, do you think that people's use of social media and their photos being up there and out there has made a big difference between 40 years ago when I was a teenager, and now? I mean, obviously, the only people who saw you then were your immediate friends who you knew at school, college, wherever you were. Now, lots and lots of people can be seeing your photo, and that sense of, therefore, how do I present myself, and the pressure and I suppose you can look and see your own photo, which in the
multiple
past,
times a day,
unless someone actually got physically a camera, sent it off to be processed, got back a print, you never really saw a photo of yourself very much, apart from those actual photos. Whereas, yes, it must be a kind of, and then there's the opportunity to compare must all increase that sense in people's mind. Well, could I improve on myself and how I look? Do you think that?
I think it absolutely feeds it, and I use that expression, which I think is so true, of comparison is the thief of all joy. And I think we all do it in life, don't we? And I think that's physically, how we look compared with somebody else, but also what we think is going on in somebody else's world. So the nature of social media is the other thing, as well as just the photos. It's that kind of, what is somebody trying to make us believe about their world? Well, you never see somebody put on social media, I'm having a rotten day, I feel miserable, I've had a row with my partner. You don't. Well, maybe you do, but very rarely. You don't see that as much. You'll always see the cute pictures of the perfect family, or having a fun day out, or wearing that new outfit, whatever it might be. And if we're not feeling great and we're not able to kind of compartmentalize that and just evaluate it properly, we can end up thinking that person's life is so much better than mine. I feel inferior. I can't cope with that emotion. I don't know how to process that. And something like an eating disorder, an eating disorder's there to be your friend 24/7. It's there, it's in your head all the time. There's that constant communication, that dialogue that's reminding you that the way to get validation is to do this behaviour, to feel like this about yourself. And of course, we all know it doesn't work. It leads to just a worse and worse spiral.
Debbie, thank you very much indeed. So if people want to read more about Wednesday's Child, then they can go to the website.
Yeah, absolutely.
WednesdaysChild.co.uk.
Yeah.
And if they wanted to get in touch, the email is...
Yeah, so they can email me directly. So it's Debbie, DEBBIE, at wednesdayschild.co.uk. We've got an inquiry form straight from the website. We're also on all the social media channels, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, all the rest. So yes, love to hear from anybody that wants to find out more.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.